Good afternoon and welcome to the Future of Finance. Today we will discuss why the law is such a compelling use case for AI and what law firms are doing about it. I shall now hand you over to Dominic Hobson and our panel. Thank you.
Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar, Why the Law is such a compelling use case for AI and what law firms are doing about it. I'm Dominic Hobson, co-founder of Future of Finance, and I'm delighted to moderate our discussion this afternoon. Artificial intelligence, or AI, despite its technical limitations, and we're talking not about emulations of the human brain, but about giant data-eating machines, it's increasingly everywhere, in our motor cars, our telephones, even in some cases in our refrigerators. And professions based upon the mastery of arcane areas of knowledge or techniques might be thought to be immune to being devoured by giant data-eating machines. But it's increasingly apparent that they are not. And the law of all things has emerged as an early use case for consumption, an hors d'oeuvre perhaps before generalized AI machines reduced the whole of humanity to helots. Law in the end amounts to, like so much else in our civilization, to information. And much of that information is now available in digital form, which means it can be copied instead of consumed, and it can be copied at zero or near zero marginal cost. So the question before us, it seems, is not whether the law in its present state is doomed. It is, say the AI evangelists, but how soon we will be able to judge the value of the legal advice we receive, not by the billable hours in the invoice, but by the size of our electricity bill. Now, to help us understand how the law is adapting to this prospect, I'm joined by two lawyers and an expert in AI. Nigel Brooke is a partner at London law firm Clyde & Co, where he specializes in international insurance and reinsurance. But he's also worked on smart contracts, blockchain, the Internet of Things, and other technologies since 2015. Nigel is co-founder of Clyde Code, the smart contracts consultancy offering of the firm. Nathan Evans is a partner at Harrison Clark Rickaby's, where he focuses on technology law. He's also a member of the outsourcing group committee at the Society for Computers and Law. Francisco Weber is co-founder and CEO of Cortical.io, which is trying to move AI technology beyond computational statistics of the type I just described and actually enable machines to read paperwork and even unstructured text like emails as natural language. In addition to our panelists, we do also have you, of course, our audience, and all of us encourage everybody watching or listening to submit questions and comments throughout this webinar by using the functionality at the bottom of your Zoom screens. I won't be saving any questions or comments up to the end, but we will endeavor to address them as we go along, so you can be an integral part of this discussion right from the outset. I'd like to begin by asking our two lawyers how they are using AI in their practice today. And my starting point for this is when I was researching this topic, I kept a sort of list of uses of AI in the law that I came across, and I built up a list of 16 separate things, classifying documents, assembling documents, even reading documents for those key terms and key clauses inside them, comparing documents with historical precedents, contract management, searching documents for information. So a lot of combing through documents. So perhaps, Nathan, I could come to you first. How is your firm actually using AI in the business today?
Well, like all law firms, we are exploring this. I would say that we're probably in the early stages of our explanation. Looking at the list of 16 that you put together, I was quite discouraged. I could only really tick two. But then I have a lot of colleagues. We have 800 other colleagues, and maybe I don't know everything. But we are using outsourced AI technologies to scan millions of emails in multiple languages to gather data for specific dispute resolution cases. Of course, we're exploring whether we can use AI for contract reviews and analysis as part of corporate DD, and that's probably the biggest thing that we're exploring right now. I guess those technologies is a more subset of AI in terms of machine learning and that type of technology that we're using that for. But I suppose what I'm most interested in is the things that we're not using it for. So if there are any salespersons out there that want to talk to me, I would love to be using it for horizon scanning on topics of interest to my clients and data gathering to predictive analytics to predict the trends that my clients are going through, what type of agreements they're going to need when they get to certain scales and all of these things that I don't have the data to understand myself. So I can map out my business case going forward as a partner of a large law firm. possibly sentimental analysis, but also in the business of running a law firm, you know, there are some AI technologies which are fantastic for bolstering your own cybersecurity. So, you know, although arguably maybe some AI technologies are detrimental to cybersecurity, there are many which are absolutely fabulous and can help you run your business in a more efficient and effective way. Also, I'm aware of my own massive personality traits. I've got loads of them. We've all got unconscious biases and all sorts of things. And I would love to explore using AI to, you know, scan CVs to get rid of all my unconscious biases, so I can digest these documents and understand them properly without applying my own unnecessary idiocy on some of these things. But that's me. No doubt, like Nigel's firm's doing a bit more, I suspect.
Well, Nigel, it's very interesting listening to Nathan that actually he's not interested in AI solely in order to do what's being done already more efficiently in a more automated fashion, but actually looking to expand the business, make it more effective, turn it into a sort of client advisory business, apart from anything else. Are you thinking the same way, or are you just using it to read these documents?
Yeah, it is interesting. That's our direction of travel. We're at the moment using it much more functionally. So, like every other law firm, we're using it for litigation, for discovery, collating millions of documents. That is now routine, and there's quite a range of tools now, so we can choose the most appropriate tool for the appropriate case. Where a lot of what we do is for insurance. About half our practice is servicing insurance, and we do have quite a large practice that does volume work, motor and household claims, where again we're using AI, beginning to use it to make that whole process a lot more efficient. And also, though, and this is another key element, to give management information back to clients. We're also then pushing that into aviation and other sectors, because we can spot trends at scale. If we have hundreds of thousands of cases that we're handling, so we can actually spot trends and deliver that information back to the clients, which is what they're hungry for. And we are using it to create products. So it's not just service, but actually a product that the insurers can buy on a subscription, optimizing things through the use of AI. Though AI, of course, covers a multitude of sins. It can be something pretty basic, right through to something much more sophisticated, using machine learning in the full sense. But so some of this will be fairly basic AI applications, natural language processing, and so on. But we're developing tools to predict the outcome of cases. Because a lot of the tools that are available out of the box, like Kira and so on, are optimized for things like reading leases, things for transactional work. For litigation, there's fewer tools readily available today, and so we are bespoking the existing tools for that purpose. I assume that there will be more attention paid in the next few years by AI providers to this area, because about 70% of what we do is litigation. So we are very, very keen to use AI as best we can. So again, if you're looking into this area and listening in, let us know.
Well, I was actually very pleased to note that actually on my list of 16 was using it to assess the advisability of litigation in terms
Indeed.
of costs and chances of success, but also using the data to predict the outcome of court cases. And you've found it effective in those two fields, have you?
Yeah, well, beginning to do so. There's been some terrific work done on this. Even I think it's about 4 years ago, some researchers used this to European Court of Human Rights cases. They found they were getting about 70% success in predicting the outcomes of cases there.
After feeding in the personal biases that Nathan referred to of the judges.
Exactly right. These cases aren't decided by robots. And though who knows? One day they might be.
Anyway, I'd like to come back to you too about whether you can use it for getting costs under control in a minute. So if you could think about that while I ask Francisco a question, which is legal documents tend to be, I was about to say well drafted, but on the whole, legal documents are better drafted than other types of documents. So you would have thought that's one of the reasons that AI works for this. but you've also heard Nigel mention about natural language, unstructured processing. What's your take on the application of AI to these mountains of data which lawyers work through every day?
Yeah, I mean, you already said it. For someone who works in the domain of using language as the main sort of objective, I have to say I love legal language. I mean, it's like made for machine learning. As you said, it's very clean material typically. It's astonishingly accessible in terms of you can basically find the legal code of any country online, and you can download it maybe even as XML data and so on. But beyond that, I would say specifically because we focus a lot on semantics. So we try to go beyond anything which would be like searching for words and matching words, which is a very primitive way of doing, which actually makes legal language sort of problematic for those earlier technologies, because if you have nothing than the statistics of words to characterize what a document means, then you will have a problem with, let's say, contracts, because if you make a list of words used per document, you probably end up having like always the same words in every document, and it's more sort of like how they are put there. On the other hand, if you rather work with semantics, basically everybody from the lawmaker back to the lawyer, everybody thinks like 10 times before they write something. So they try actively to be non-ambiguous or unambiguous, and to be very explicit about what is meant and so on, which is sort of perfect if you want to precisely. I mean, it sounds typically for a non-lawyer, legal text has sort of an aspect of being complex, but in reality, it's, if you are a lawyer, it's comparatively simple language in the sense of it's very straightforward to figure out what things actually mean, and so I think it's therefore a natural consequence that area has been one of the earliest to become a field of work for people who do machine learning, because it is that prototypical. So I think that's also the domain where we will see the first effects of that early work, meaning having, in fact, powerful tools. And there are a lot of tools out there. It's still, I would say, first generation, because, in fact, when you get a legal tool, what you actually get is a legal model, yeah, with some software around it to make it to allow you to interact with it. But basically you license models. And this, to me, is sort of a more primordial stage. I think in the end, the solutions will be of the kind that the specialist himself can actually create the model. That's where we need to go. And that's basically when we will have things like Word for lawyers with the typical kind of intelligence that is needed. Yeah.
You use the term semantics, by which you mean what things mean.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we appoint lawyers because we want in our contracts, for example, to be absolutely clear what we mean. It's quite difficult to achieve that, and they've developed this special language to make things as clear as possible. And again, that's something which, from what you were saying, makes the law, in one sense, amenable to AI, but in another sense, less amenable. So which, I think I heard you say both those things. Which is it? Is the law ideally suited to AI, or does its quest for perfect meanings make it more difficult?
So as someone who is working to sort of enter a new kind of AI in terms of two aspects, one precisely about not learning the data, but learning the semantics of the data. That is one aspect that we focus on. And the second is to make it efficient, because in the end, any or close to any algorithm, given enough time and given enough computing resources, can find out how things work. The problem is an algorithm doing this within 2 minutes or 15,000 years, and therefore waiting for a quantum computer to try again. So that's, I think, the big question for that kind of solution to be actually deployed as a commodity, which I think it should be at some point.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about the cost of 15,000 years and computing power in a minute. But before we do, perhaps, as I said a minute ago, Nathan and Nigel, I'd be interested in whether you see AI as a means of getting costs under control in your firm. Obviously, having very highly trained, highly talented people working in your firm, and you're selling their time, that's what makes the law expensive. Is there a way in which you can actually use AI? Have you thought about this to lower fees? Either you can give work to less qualified people who can work with the machine more successfully. Maybe you can even start to do things like ask yourself the question, well, is this piece of work actually worth doing for this client at this price? Is it worth our while doing it? Is it sufficiently profitable for us? Are you thinking about AI in that way, Nigel?
Yes, we are. AI in combination with project management. So, for example, for certain kinds of litigation we're beginning to atomize the process from getting the instruction to the trial, breaking down the various stages. This would be mainly for costs purposes, to try to keep costs under control. Looking at hundreds of cases, working out what are the stages where things can go off the rails, it can become more expensive than you originally anticipated, or where there are opportunities to save costs. It may be, for example, you say this is a stage where we don't actually need a very senior team on it. We can delegate this down. We might be able to automate some of this. Maybe the client with their own resources can help us out at this stage, and so on. So this is nothing new. This has been done before, but we're applying this now to the various kinds of cases we do. And that should enable us to give a much more accurate cost estimate and to control the costs as we go along. Also, there's this idea of using AI at the various recognized stages in the case to access the appropriate resources. At this stage, it'd be useful to have a database of relevant precedents. And part of this, of course, it's technology is not 100% solution to any of this. It does take a lot of movement from the lawyers involved as well, a lot of engagement. So it would be, first of all, getting past the mindset that every case is bespoke, every case is a one-off. I'm an artisan approach, and actually recognizing that actually what you're going through now probably has been done hundreds of times before, and there are lessons to be learned here. Using AI to access those resources, the precedents, or putting in touch with the right person to consult at that stage. So those kind of things, those are the kind of use cases we're looking at.
So Nathan, 70% of your business is not litigation, I assume. So you're a different type of law firm, but cost reduction?
Well, I think there's two costs to my business. There's the cost that the client sees, so that's the fees they pay that are going out the door, and increasingly there's a lot of pressure on those costs. So you might find that, I don't know, as part of a corporate DD, a client is unwilling or doesn't want to review a whole suite of documents because the cost of doing that would be too high. And then we can say, okay, we've identified these contracts as being relatively low value, low risk. We'll run that through the AI. You can have that as a value add or a fixed fee, whatever it might be. The secondary cost, I think, is in rehiring the people you lose by giving them repetitive work and not completely getting rid of that. I'm not saying we totally get rid of that work, but reducing the burden of doing that work is beneficial from us as an employer, I think, and it helps our associates develop. Whereas they're reviewing the work of the machines rather than doing the work of the machines and then reviewing the work of the machines, and I review the work that they do. I think it makes for a more rounded lawyer, and I think that there's a lot of benefits to deploying the technologies. And I don't think that this spells the doom of the lawyer. Far from it. I think it frees us up to do things that we should be doing, and that's advising is at a strategic level. So, outside the conversation of AI, there's a whole host and suite of technologies that we should be using, not least of all contract automation and drafting assisting tools that I use quite frequently to drive down costs. And there's a few reasons for it. I think there's going to be, as I say, there's pressure on fees generally, but there's also pressure on the time materials model that we deploy, and we need to start thinking quite creatively about how we cost the work that we do going forward, because clients expect it.
Will we one day get to the customer self-help tool?
We may already be there.
Mm-hmm.
We may already be there, because there are solutions that certainly my practice works with, where you can take quite detailed instructions and code quite complicated contracts that can apply in multiple different scenarios. They can go through a questionnaire and they can be relatively comfortable that the document that is spat out at the other end is going to be correct for that use case. And you run that as, I don't know, law as a service, I guess. Now it's a bit off topic, I guess, because I wouldn't see that as an AI technology. That's a more simplified coding technology, but they do work together. And then going back to Francisco's comment about the investment in time it takes to train the AI, so I couldn't agree more with that. I think a lot of lawyers do anticipate that when the software lands on their desk and they open the box, out pops this solution that's going to work. Doesn't work, never works, because the document scanning software, for example, might pull out 5 different clauses within a document that has something to do with capping liability, all of them wrong. And you have to tell the machine and train the machine, and then over time it will develop itself. So this isn't there's no silver bullet here, I don't think. Unless Nigel's
it might be cheaper than sending everybody to university and then having them do long apprenticeships inside the firm, no?
No, I'm happy to be absolutely wrong, but I think that clients still like to have the human touch and human interaction that goes along with this. And what they're looking for is law firms to deploy technology in a way that streamlines and makes the work that we do more efficient. I don't think.
I'm going to ask Francisco this question in a minute about the cost. I mean, did the actual cost of the AI itself, when you first invested in this machine and started training it, was that a barrier or not?
Yeah, currently it is still a barrier, because we have not yet the kind of base technology that we would want to have. I mean, I think the AI companies are the first ones who actually would need AI precisely to create training sets properly. I mean, that's kind of a very meticulous type of work. And once you have entered some wrong records in your training collection, you never find them again. So you have to be very careful on what you do. But I think that in general, the legal industry will evolve very similar to most of the other industries that we've seen so far, is that they need to become more efficient, they need to automate. And through automation, there will be quite substantial number of tasks that will shift to other places. Yeah. So, for example, today, and I mean that might be quite a superficial view, but remember, I'm not a lawyer myself, so. Sort of a lot of the actual work ends up being done by paralegals, for example, the kind of heavy work that needs the heavy lifting in the whole thing. And all the limitations and the whole business model of legal industry basically relates to that number of paralegals. So for certain types of cases, it depends on how much you can afford. According to this, you can choose a law firm that has, let's say, a huge infrastructure for doing research work and stuff like that. And that puts you in the end in a legally stronger position. But in a world where the paralegal is sort of replaced by an automatic procedure that doesn't care if it has to sift through 1 million documents or 1 billion documents, that distinction will not be there. And that, I think, will affect even the business model that you encounter. Suddenly, you could find a very small law firm capable, due to the way they use their AI, let's say, to handle large and complex cases with sort of the same power as a big law firm. So I think that will be one level of, or one earlier level of change. Later on, I'm pretty sure that beyond the pure fact checking and fact searching tasks, there will be a lot of strategic tasks that are currently precisely done by the lawyer that will be automated. And in the end, or let's say my hopefully positive vision of the fully automated future is that humans will mostly remain at the interfaces. So at the interface from the legal system to the customer, who typically is a human, you will also need to put a human in order to do an adequate communication. And the task of the lawyer probably more becomes how to educate, inform, handle the customer, because the strategy will be generated based on the completeness of fact that have been taken into account.
That's an interesting point, which Francisco made there, about how this technology can actually make smaller firms competitive with larger ones. You don't have to be Clifford Chance with offices everywhere and hundreds of partners in order to be competitive for very quite complex pieces of business. I was wondering, Nigel, whether you think that this makes you more competitive, perhaps even outside the fields in which you specialize, like trade and insurance and the litigation involved in those cases. Are you seeing this actually as a competitive weapon against other
well,
firms?
we're a large law firm, and I do see the threat. I think in certain sectors there is a threat there. We saw a demonstration 2 or 3 years ago about a bankruptcy tool where you can put in a bankruptcy question. This has been trained on federal law, but you were able to put in a natural language question and get what looked for all the world like an attorney memo back, 2.5 pages of analysis, case law, and conclusion. Quite spooky, and that will only improve over time. Now, of course, you would not just give that to the client and say that there we are, that's the law, but it does at least put you at a big advantage that you can take that as a starting point. That's even a small law firm that doesn't have that kind of depth of knowledge of that area. And I can see that developing over time, so you have access to these rather smart resources at a much lower cost. Where the large law firms may still have an advantage for the time being, and I'm not saying this is a permanent inherent advantage, is the data sets. So if you do handle tens of thousands of a certain kind of thing, and you have access to materials and data points that aren't available in the public domain, then that means you could retain an advantage there. Perhaps that extra level of sophistication you get in, for example, predicting the outcome of a case. Or
You're basically training your AI to kind of absorb your experience.
Yes.
So if you were, I don't know, you specialize in your case in insurance, but maybe it could be private equity, for example. And the more private equity deals, like the more insurance deals you see, probably like the more bad marriages you see, get better. Your advice gets better because it's based on experience. Somehow you've got to translate that experience into the machine.
Yes. And it's taking what at the moment is tacit knowledge. It's the fruit of experience, and systematizing that. And of course, that's what a lot of firms would like to do, is just create a kind of hive mind where you've taken the whole firm's tacit knowledge out of people's heads and into a system, if this were possible, so that it was accessible to all. Now, of course, therein lies the seeds of your destruction as well, because that system, if it's kept up to date, could then replace those ones. But I think perhaps this perhaps a challenge for Francisco, that we take for granted the kind of common sense angle to this. That, for example, I can draft a contract, but is that the right contract for this particular client or this particular department of this particular client, given their history, given what I know about how they came to this position, that problem they had 5 years ago, and so on. So the kind of things which are tacit but very, very hard to put down and systematize, that they're one-offs. There's that human element and how things are done around here. A lot of you can try to systematize your own tacit knowledge, but you haven't done the same with your client's tacit knowledge.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of these areas which will be hard to put into AI.
I do agree. I think in the upcoming automated future, everything will be about culture, because that's actually the human domain.
Yes.
And there is culture in everything. Yeah. So even in drafting laws, there is culture. Sort of. Therefore, whenever information goes from one individual to the other, it has to pass that cultural interface. And I think that will be mostly the work of the future, that someone has an expertise in some domain and then becomes a cultural interface to access or connect to other systems so that they can work in a cluster. So it's kind of a very new kind of work, I think, but not less interesting or challenging. And yeah, we will all have sociology and pedagogy in school as part of the basic education.
I like this term tacit knowledge. It reminds me of a sort of problem in information theory where, and it's interesting that communism, for example, has come back into fashion recently. Books have been published saying, well, if Walmart can stock the shelves on time using machines, why can't we eradicate poverty by using AI as well? And I think the piece which is missing is that tacit knowledge. No matter how much information you gather into your machine, you're never really going to fully understand what happens at the periphery. That's the tacit knowledge that Nigel is referring to. So there probably are limits to how much of the lawyer can be replaced by a machine in the end, and until we get to some sort of general AI, in which case we're all doomed, I suppose.
But I think long before we have the general AI, we will have when there is something like the expertise a human can have to teach a machine, that process itself can be modeled and automated. So there is this kind of incremental improvement on the layers also that I think will accelerate things dramatically.
Nathan, we've talked about AI as if it means one thing and we will understand what that thing is. But one of the things Nigel mentioned a few minutes ago was that these sort of oracles, you can put a bankruptcy question into Google and it gives you some sort of answer back. Those machines are bound to get better. So they remind me of the sort of neural networks, which we talked about 20, 25 years ago, where your doctor would you'd describe your symptoms and it would give you a course of pills to put it right. So there's lots of different components here in AI. One is the machine learning, which we've really been talking about, teaching your machines to be better lawyers. But there's also automating processes. There are processes in law as there are in everything else, I suppose, and you can kind of automate those. There's quite a lot of data science in this. And we used to talk about expert systems as well. Maybe that's the right term for what Nigel was describing. But you're a member of the society, law and the computer. Has fascinated you're in this outsourcing group. Does that mean lawyers are starting to think about putting together different pieces of knowledge from different areas, different sets of data to create a whole new business, really?
I guess the outsourcing group in the SAL is a collaborative space for commercial lawyers who practice the same type of law, that being large scale commercial outsourcing pieces. So we do come across multiple deals, I suppose, where the clients, typically savvy IT clients, are deploying robotic process automation. We typically advise on the appropriate warranties and remedies and all these sorts of things that
the clients are advising, not lawyers.
But I suppose the wider question is, well, do we care what flavor of AI we're using as part of our business? And to simplify this, I think my answer to that is probably no. I'm more outcomes driven than tech driven. So for example, I would ask the same question, well, do I care that I call this machine learning over AI or as a subset of AI? No, in the same way that I don't necessarily need to use blockchain for the sake of it being a blockchain. I just care about what the output is. So there are problems which I'm trying to solve. Some of those problems are quite helpfully solved by AI, whether it's robotic process automation or whether it's machine learning. It doesn't really, as a consumer of technology, doesn't really matter to me. Now, Francisco may violently disagree with me on that,
No.
and it does matter. All right, but in terms of being a commercial lawyer and whether I'm an outsourcing practitioner or not, the things which will help my day-to-day life will be easier and more manageable tools for drafting contracts that take the stress out of compiling tailored bespoke agreements, which I think that as a firm, HCR are already doing a good job at that and driving down efficiencies and costs on that. And then the work that we've already discussed, which is the document review piece as part of corporate due diligence. And those are really the two things that I tend to focus on. And then there will be, as I said earlier, at the top of the call, there will be, I guess, educational pieces driven by AI, which will be helpful for me in terms of horizon scanning, predefining where my clients are going to be in the next 10 years based on where they've been. Would help me, not in terms of just resourcing, but advising them as to what type of agreements and deals they might be looking at into the future, and they should start thinking about earlier rather than later. Then they'll get there quicker.
Nigel, is it possible for AI will actually create new forms of legal knowledge? We've talked a lot about the benefits of this in terms of making it cheaper and more accessible, raising the quality and so on. But could it actually add something to the law? Could it just read through reams of data and come up with great new insights which you could apply on behalf of your clients?
I think it could, in principle. I've not seen it happen yet, but I could see in principle how it could happen. Like in other domains, that there's a distinctive limit to the amount of information that any of us can absorb. And we've got such a fire hose of data now. If you had a system that could ingest a huge amount of data and apply ultra sophisticated technology to that, it may well find patterns that aren't available to us. There's examples from other domains where you've got superhuman outputs, like, for example, the scan of the retina the system, an MI, can actually tell you what gender that the person is. And eye experts who've looked at this image cannot work out what signals the system is picking up there. So I can imagine there could be things like that where they can see through in a way that we can't, which would be quite scary. But also, law is it's human created. These are principles that have been they're not. There's nothing natural about them, and as we see from the variety of legal systems around the world. And it may be able to come up with better systems of law as well. If you get some understanding of what you're trying to accomplish, maybe it'll find better ways of doing it, or better ways of contracting, for example, to achieve what the parties want to achieve.
Yeah, I think that's a potential. In fact, so far we have been talking on the industry as being attached to a legal body or a legal or a law, basically. But what if one would apply AI techniques to actually generate law? Because I think from an abstract point of view, it's law is about managing the human nature with the human culture given, sort of, and make that make rules about how we operate naturally. So that's typically a domain, I think, that can be mathematically or logically accessed, and that's something that you can actually model using computers. But the tedious part of the work is to make it compatible with the humans. That's why you have things like politics and people discussing about laws. But if they would discuss a model that can be guaranteed to be consistent, for example, because it has been checked and created by a logical system, and then you discuss what could that be in real world terms. Yeah.
I entirely agree.
Okay, Nathan, do you think that the society would be comfortable, on Francisco's point, with machines as opposed to judges? And they're called judges because they make judgments, about complex moral issues, euthanasia, child custody, and so on, if it was made by this logical machine rather than this flesh and blood judge with their personal biases of the type you've recommended, could we get comfortable with that as a society? Which prompts a couple of other thoughts in my mind about if we're relying on machines to make legal decisions. What if the advice is duff? Who are you going to sue when the machine gives you incompetent advice? What about all this data which you're consuming, documents and personal details and so on? How secure are these AI platforms when they're processing this data? And I wonder if it starts to create sort of inequalities. People who can afford access to AI versus people who can't. The law should be, everyone should be equal before the law, or at least in principle, if not always in practice. So I know the old joke about the law being open to everyone, so is the writs, but in principle, that's the honor is in the breach as well as the observance, I suppose.
My God, I'm in the wrong profession and job if I can answer that. That's an incredibly difficult question.
I
think at a higher level, I think the point of the law is to apply the societal contract in an even and equitable way across society, and I think that AI can be a useful tool in assisting that. I personally would be uncomfortable with a machine deciding on cases of the type that you described, where I feel that there needs to be a human element of that, and the judges in this country are well renowned at exercising their discretion and humanity when appropriate to do so. And from my perspective, I'd like things to stay the way they are.
Well, there's an example in the States. There's a tool that's been developed, it's been deployed now by a number of states for several years to help. The aim was quite a noble one, which is to help get more consistent sentencing. But of course, what the data is relying on is how cases with similar facts have been sentenced in the past by fallible judges. So what you're doing then is ingesting fallible data with biases all over the place, and then spewing that out. And the problem, of course, is not so much that it's doing that, but that is problematic. It's the idea that it appears like an oracle. Oh, well, the system says 2 years, so who am I to argue with that? It's the credence we give to these systems as well as the how they work. And of course, these are commercial systems, so the company involved is not prepared to share the algorithm.
It's entirely identical, isn't it, with the more simplified products? So say taking contract automation, for example, you spent 100 hours drafting this perfectly coded document and you've applied an error, a human error, because you wrote it in the first place. You then go off into the sunset drafting these things, and you're duplicating this error 100, 200,000 times over the course of the next decade, because you're not applying thought anymore. So and this is the point, I think, that there will still be room for educated young lawyers to apply a measure of thought and their art to the work of law, moving away from technology. I do think that part of the role of the lawyer is artistic as well as formulaic.
Is that the point that Nigel made there? Is that a general problem in AI? That if you take the United States sentencing example he gave, you've got a load of right-wing judges give this verdict, a load of left-wing ones gives that, you've got to average it out and you come out at what would be a reasonable mean. But is that a problem generally in AI, that you're reliant on past data, which is of course itself a product of human biases and prejudices of various types?
Of course.
Machines correct for it.
And I mean, you call it bias. The machine cannot detect if it's a bias. What it sees is that there is a certain nature to the data set it works with. So the problem is not so much that we face biases in all contexts we can possibly imagine. And I would say the worst biasing machine are actually humans. Yeah, I mean, computer generates far less bias. If applied in a certain way, you can capture and freeze historical human bias. And because it ends up, and that is where I think currently the problem is once you fed the data into the machine, you have no more access to it. You cannot find the one record that has introduced a certain error within the model. You have to redo the model itself. But what if building the model, so like, for example, there is this famous GPT-3 text model that is currently, I think, even in newspapers, that does wonderful things. But you don't have to forget, it costs about $10 million to compute that model once. Yeah? So, and it takes a couple of weeks while spending $10 million. So if within the basically data collection that machine was trained on, you want to find the 5 records that introduce a bias for a certain use case, and these are all floating point numbers, yeah, representing some weights between 2 specific artificial neurons in the model. So that's nothing a human could ever relate to. And that is the problem of the bias, because if you have humans facing human bias, then you can have countermeasures. You can reevaluate certain things. You can argue. All of that is not possible currently with the technologies we have in AI, because we cannot drill down into the data once we have ingested it. So, for example, at Cortical, we are focusing a lot on this aspect, so that every model, even if it's ready computed, you can still drill down to the very sentence that it was trained on. And it's worth the effort, because like that, you can actually continuously improve. You can find unwanted pieces of data and eliminate them or correct them. And like that, it behaves more like an actual human who sort of learns from errors and tries not to do them again. So I think it's mostly a technical constraint for now.
We've had an interesting observation by a member of the audience here, Jessel Ranuka, who says that maths is only an abstract of reality with limitations and assumptions. Hence, it is explainable and interruptible. And she goes on to say, judges will ask how AI made the decision and why. So the machine, because it's based on mathematics, and mathematics is explainable, it's interruptible. Actually, I think she's saying to us that it's an AI bias detection machine. In fact, it can be, which is an interesting observation. Well, I sort of like that idea.
Yeah, but you can use mathematics to formulate sort of transcendental things also. That's precisely the power of mathematics, that mathematics don't care what you model with. It can be, I don't know, the beauty of a painting, and you can derive certain formula that will allow a certain approach to the facts. So I think in the end, there is nothing that brains can do that we will not at some point be able to do artificially, in the sense of using computational devices. But again, that still is only half of the job, because that's just a thinking job. And there is still the communication job to be done. And if in the end, the information has to reach a human, there needs to be communication with a human. And I think there will never be anything better than a human to communicate with a human, because they have grown for that. Yeah. And that's where I think we need to go. We have to make to use machines for things that can be computed, and we have to use humans for things that have to be communicated. And the whole thing gives a network, basically connecting all of us and our entities that we create, like companies or countries or whatever.
I think Jessel Ranuka has hit the nub of the issue in terms of the economics of the law moving forward. If these machines are capable, in effect, if you're wrong, Francisco, that actually and Nathan, the human being in the end is redundant in this fully developed model, that legal knowledge becomes fully commoditized. Any value you can add to it is the occasional correction of errors, in exactly the way you were describing, Francisco, going right down to the particular sentence. And so at that point, if legal knowledge is completely commoditized, you don't need human beings. It's just another story of how technology has destroyed a way of making a living, isn't it? And I'm wondering, you know, like like the sort of buggy whip makers or the stagecoach makers when the car came along.
Well, I think that the way I think about this, there are certain domains like medicine where you could see, in principle, that a system that's trained on millions of cases could become a better eye surgeon or better diagnose.
Radiology is a very good example of that. It's just reading digital images. Yeah.
But where there is actually a right answer. Are there cancerous cells here at a dangerous level or not? These are ultimately answerable questions. And that's exactly what a consultant would be looking for. Maybe the system can actually do the same thing, but better. But the law, as Nathan said earlier, is a social construct. So, for example, we determine how various rights are to be balanced. We craft our Declaration of Human Rights or our code of company law, who bears the relative risk, what's best for the function of society or the economy or whatever. But it also, as Francisco said, inevitably, it's got cultural values embedded in it to a greater or lesser degree. I don't think many people would actually want a purely technocratic code of law, particularly in areas like you mentioned earlier, Dominic, about children's rights and so on. You may, once you've determined the appropriate balance, you might then be able to leave the system to determine case by case, how do I now apply these principles and laws?
Yeah, but maybe law by itself could become to some degree obsolete as a surfacing entity, because if you did something which was against a certain law, might result in a fine, and the fine might be automatically recuperated from your account. So you might not even notice anymore that you have been in contact with sort of a legal machine in the background, but everything just operated normally. I think the only special part, if you want, are things like maybe criminal law and so on, where the human factor again became part of the thing. That's like you compared it to the field of medicine. I personally think that most of what doctors do today will be better implemented in software. So I keep joking by saying in 10 years, I will only accept an artificial doctor when it's about my diagnosis. But the point I would make here is, let's say I have a certain diagnosis and then I need to go and have treatment where I would actually need a human who has healthcare training. Is the person who helps me step from one treatment site to the other, talking to me and trying to sort of get me positive and so on. So that interaction is something no computer could give me, that feeling and that satisfaction of talking to someone about my problem. Yeah, but the 1 minute 20 time I have sitting in front of a doctor trying to stutter out the description of my pain, that could be easily replaced by a machine that takes a bunch of samples of me and just outputs with like 99.9% precision based on everything that has been ever published, stuff that no human could do. Yeah, and I think that correlates or could correlate to some degree also with the legal domain, that there is a large body of activities that we just do because we are humans. We have to do it that way, but
I can tell, Francisco, by the fact you need a human to make you feel good about yourself. You've never owned a Tamagotchi, obviously.
But I remember it. I'm of the generation to remember Tamagotchi.
We've had another a question here. What's the future regulation and rules on AI implementation? Which is a very big question, covering the whole field, I suppose. But maybe the best way to answer it, and Nathan, I'm sure you've got a view on this, is this actually a promising area of new law for people about how we govern implementation of AI?
Well, I think largely it's a question to ask us again in the early part of 2022. We're waiting a white paper from the UK government following their national strategy that was released in September. The European Union's going in a slightly different direction, maybe a bit more codified. I think that the UK government is thinking about maybe repurposing some of the legislation we currently have in place. So the answer is don't know. But it will become more clear in the coming months. It's sooner rather than later, I think. Unless Nigel is familiar with something I'm not.
No, I think there is an inherent problem, I think, with regulation. But let's wait and see what they come out with. But you could freeze things in time. That you're tackling the problem as you understand it today, and the problem will mutate. The systems, if a system is just looking for correlations, this is something that was tried in the States. There are all sorts of laws against bias, so that if you have humans looking at cases, they know what steps that they're allowed, they must take. They know the things they're not allowed to take into consideration. You can tell a system you mustn't look for protected characteristics. You mustn't look for sex, race, economic background, etc., when you're considering whether to give a loan, for example, or whether to pay a claim. But if the system looks for correlations, then it ingests huge amounts of data from social media and so on, then it will actually find correlates for the things it's not meant to look for. And so I think it's, even with the best intentioned laws, it's going to be really difficult to bring this to heel.
The comment here is we can't use AI to its fullest as we don't understand how AI comes to its decisions. But just very quickly, we're into our last 5 minutes here, Francisco. Is this fear of a black box society, this regulations which Nathan has referred to coming into play, is that actually forming a constraint on the development of AI technologies yet?
I think that the black box approach is just due to the very early stage we're in. Yeah. So we have discovered a new computational method, and anything technologically complex enough can be regarded by the uneducated observer as being magic, and that is scary in certain domains. But I think if you look sort of at the evolution of other technologies, there are phases, and once it can only go into commodity when we overcome this. So there will be a generation, let's say, of AIs in somewhere in the future that will not be a black box precisely. And the other thing is, if we get there, that's regarding the previous question, we will definitely need regulation. So probably many of the peers in my commercial ecosystem will not agree with me, but I'm one of the, let's say, rare AI protagonists who claims regulation. I think any dangerous technology, dangerous in the sense that you cannot afford to make errors. So like with dangerous chemicals, for example, if you have a business that transports dangerous chemicals, you have a very strict sort of framework by which you can do this, and as long as you stick to it, you can do whatever is needed to do. As we see in recent days, influence of machine learning on elections and the like can have huge impacts. So I don't think we can let this just grow by sort of business opportunism. We have, as a society, to regulate it, at least until it's more sort of the way like we want it to be.
Okay, we've only got a minute left, so I think it's a very good point Francisco is making. Actually, sounds like really good news for lawyers. Actually, the industry needs to be regulated, needs laws around it. So there's more work for you all in that. But before we go, I'd like to give you each of you just an opportunity to give us one last comment. Obviously, you know, the four of us sitting here are kind of signed up to AI as a positive thing, probably in law on the whole, and you guys are making use of it. There'll be people out there who have completely the opposite view. What's your sense, Nigel? I'll ask the same question of you, Nathan, and you, Francisco. What's your sense of where the law is as a profession as a whole? Is it alive to this threat and this opportunity and wants to adapt to it and sees possibilities to create new types of firm, new businesses, as Nathan was describing right at the outset, or is there a great deal more fear than greed and hope?
I think it's more towards the latter end. I think where I see law firms adopting AI, and there's some big adoption, there's some really big investment in AI. I think it's more about trying to maintain broadly the same way of doing things, but doing it better. But I think there is what's coming, I don't know where from, will be the disruptive models where new players, perhaps not even led by lawyers, will seek to use AI to disrupt the system. And where I think that perhaps the first end might be exactly where it's needed, which is the democratization of law and make it much, much more affordable for starting with simpler cases.
So, Nathan, you heard Nigel say it's a lot of lawyers are thinking about this, of doing what we do now, but do it better and making it, democratizing the law, making it available to more people and so on. But you spoke very eloquently at the outset about how you can actually reinvent law as a business by using AI. That's what excites you.
It does excite me. I couldn't agree more with Nigel, by the way. And I think that part of doing things better is reimagining how we do things currently. And I don't think that clients want or expect us to, for example, go off and draft a contract from scratch, pulling in lots of precedents. I think they want something a bit more sophisticated than that. I don't think that lawyers are unnecessarily worried. I think that our profession is quite dynamic and progressive, generally speaking. We're one of, not the, but one of the oldest professions, and we'll be around for a bit longer, I think.
You missed the joke,
So we'll be okay, but you know, like we're not, we don't have some special status where we shouldn't be disrupted, and I don't think that we should be blind to that fact. And we will be disrupted. We need to move with it. And generally speaking, I think the profession is doing that. You can't go on social media without seeing law firms posting what new novel ideas they're coming out with to impress their clients, and clients are increasingly demanding this as part of all of our pitch engagements anyway. So unless you've got good answers to these things, you're no longer competing in the market. So our hands are forced. Even if we didn't want to do this, we have to. That's where we are.
Francisco, a last word from you then. Are you, when you talk to clients in the legal profession, is it about how they can carry on doing what they're doing more efficiently? I can make your business more profitable if you like, or is it about you could totally reinvent and reimagine how you do law and what the law does? Which of those conversations are you having most?
Well, I think this is directly correlated to what I would call the maturity in terms of machine learning of the company we speak to. So there are astonishingly coherent phases in the development of an organization by adopting AI. As so very often, the very first steps tend to be very painful, and you fall over a number of times. But you just have to keep trying. And I think there are programmatic aha effects that happen as an organization or a company learns on the possibilities. Yeah, so it's like and forgive me the thing. It's like a child that learns to walk. Yeah, so the first steps are more worrying about hitting something. And then suddenly you realize, I can move my body around in the world, and that changes everything. Yeah? And so that could maybe from today be characterized as a disruption. I just think it's just evolution, like everything else. Yeah.
Thank you, Francisco. And I'd love to continue this discussion, but sadly our time is now up. I'd like to thank our panelists, Nigel Brook from Clyde & Co., Nathan Evans from Harrison Clark Rickabees, and Francisco Weber from Cortical.io. Thank you also to our audience for your very interesting, stimulating questions and comments. At Future of Finance, we're taking a break now for Christmas, but we'll be back in January the 20th, talking about the impact of tokenization on the securities markets. I hope lots of you will join us then, but until then, I'd like to wish you all a very happy Christmas and it's goodbye from the four of us.
Bye.